Welcome, everyone. It's such a wonderful pleasure to welcome you here this evening as we continue our celebration of the Moosnick Lectures. We've been really delighted to be able to learn yesterday evening and again this evening with Dr. Melissa Klapper, and the title of her talk yesterday, Ballots, Babies, and Banners of Peace, American Jewish Women and First Wave Feminism. You can actually hear the full lecture again, or if you haven't, you can find that on the website for this series. A couple of notes of introduction and a bit of housekeeping to help us all run through this wonderful opportunity as effectively as possible. First of all, I'm Rabbi Rachel Sabbath Beit Halachmi from Ohavei Zion Synagogue in Lexington, Kentucky. And I am joined here by a number of colleagues who will introduce themselves as we move through the evening, representing both Temple Adath Israel, representing Transylvania University, representing the Lexington Theological Seminary, and of course, representing the Moosnick family. So we're just delighted to be able to welcome all of you here this evening. I want to begin, as I said, with some notes of housekeeping, just so everyone will have a sense of how best to function together in this way. We so wish we were together in person. But one of the things that we want to do is welcome you and also acknowledge that this Moosnick Lectureship in Judaic Studies was created by Warren Rosenthal, and it was in honor of Franklin Moosnick, and I invite everyone to learn more about them. Our closed captioning is available for anyone who would like it. It's also available, you'll see it on your screen. You just click on the closed caption button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can turn on the captions that way. We invite questions. That's the main purpose of this evening. And those questions should be submitted into there's a Q&A box also available at the bottom of your screen. And please do submit your question at any time to our panelists, and we'll bring them to our lecturers' attention. We also want to acknowledge this evening and pause just for a moment, because in fact, we are at a very auspicious and a very important time, not only in terms of being able to think very carefully and very deeply about the role of women in this democracy, but we're also this evening remembering the anniversary of the Pittsburgh massacre at the Tree of Life congregation in Pittsburgh and the victims of that massacre. And we're also remembering, which was 2 years ago, and we're also remembering a year ago, the horrific shooting at the Kroger in Louisville and the victims there of Maurice Stallard and Vicki Lee Jones. And so I wanted to, as I also read the names of those we lost in the Pittsburgh massacre, I wanted to invite everyone to just pause for a moment of reflection. The victims at the Tree of Life, individuals, Jews celebrating the Sabbath. Those killed were Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil and David Rosenthal, Bernice and Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, and Irvin Younger. May their memories be for a blessing. And may we, as people gathered here to celebrate life and to celebrate democracy, help ensure that there are no victims such as these, no victims such as the one in Louisville ever again in the future. At this time, I want to also invite Madeline Lakes Moosnick of the Moosnick family to share an introduction to this evening.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Madeline Moosnick Lakes, though many of you may know me as Mimi. Dr. Franklin Moosnick, of beloved memory, is a proud alumnus of Transylvania University, and for him, the lectureship in Judaic Studies is named was my father. My uncle, Dr. Monroe Moosnick, of blessed memory, was one of the most legendary of Transylvania faculty members. And by the way, all of the Moosnick women, my cousins Miriam and Rosie and I, are all also proud Transy alums. My dad would certainly be thrilled by the evolutionary success of these lectures. So on behalf of the entire Moosnick family, I'm honored to have the opportunity to express our thanks to Transylvania University and the Lexington Theological Seminary for their continued interest and sponsorship of these important lectures. Our thanks also go to the synagogue and the temple for their strong support. I would also like to take the opportunity to specifically remember a dear friend of my father's who was a great friend of Transy and LTS, who we lost just a year ago, Mr. Warren Rosenthal, whose generosity established this lecture series. Tonight, it strikes me as a beautiful turn of the circle of life that just 3 years ago, it was Rabbi Sabbath who was the lecturer. And now she is becoming an integral part of the Lexington community. Regarding this year's lecture, Dr. Melissa Klapper is an award-winning author and historian with a unique ability to describe the American experience, particularly that of Jewish girls and women in the 20th century. Not to slight my father, but I say right on to that line of scholarship, as my mother, my Aunt Sonia, and all the women of the Lexington Jewish community have shared a century-plus long history of affiliation, activism, and leadership. Women's leadership and activism via congregational sisterhoods, Hadassah, Jewish Federation, education, local businesses, and yes, even politics. The many themes which exemplified the mission of the Moosnick Lectureship in the Judaic Studies, such as those as activism, leadership, and inclusion, can assist in fostering engagement and dialogue in our communities and in our hearts. Thank you, Dr. Klapper, for joining us here, and welcome, everyone.
Thank you so much, Madeline. It's so wonderful to join you, of course, in this capacity. I want to turn now, before we begin some questions, I also want to say another word of introduction about our wonderful speaker and scholar from whom we've already learned so much. Melissa Klapper is a professor of history and director of women's and gender studies at Rowan University. She's an award-winning author of several books on American Jewish women and the history of American childhood, and of course, including a volume entitled Ballots, Babies, and Banners of Peace, American Jewish Women's Activism between 1890 and 1940, which won the National Jewish Book Award in Women's Studies, which is a huge, huge deal, a wonderful honor, Mazel Tov again, and recently released a volume called Ballet Class, An American History. We have so much more to learn from you, Dr. Klapper. I am just so excited, and I'm looking now to begin already to bring some questions to the fore. Perhaps you'd like to say a word of introduction before we get started.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you virtually, if not in person. I do want to say just a couple of words, since I know that not everybody who has joined us this evening necessarily had a chance to watch the lecture. So let me just say a few words about the long legacy of American Jewish women's activism in the United States. I'm going to focus my remarks tonight, and I imagine most of the questions and answers will be about the topic of my book and the lecture, which is actually American Jewish women's participation, not so much in the very Jewish forms of activism that were available to them, although certainly there were many women who were involved in both, but I'm particularly interested in tracing the activism of American Jewish women who were involved with the great social and political movements of the day, the larger women's movement, as is of course the focus here. And that includes specifically the suffrage, birth control, and peace movements. In all of these movements, all of which had 19th century roots, but extended well into the 20th century and kind of picked up steam with the arrival of the new century. In all of these movements, American Jewish women played an important part. In the suffrage movement, American Jewish women were involved in both the mainstream suffrage movement, as exemplified in the National American Woman Suffrage Association, and also the more militant arm of the suffrage movement in the United States, the National Woman's Party. Jewish women were involved in state-level referenda. The suffrage movement proceeded on two fronts, trying both to get an amendment passed to the US Constitution. But since that seemed to be taking an awfully long time, they also tried to get various states to have their own suffrage campaigns and their own suffrage referenda campaigns. And Jewish women were instrumentally involved in many of the successes and also in some of the defeats. In 1915, for instance, 4 northeastern states, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, all had suffrage referenda. None of them passed. Jewish women were very heavily involved in all of them. In the birth control movement, Jewish women were involved in several different ways. They were consumers. Jewish women were very active consumers of birth control. They wanted not have any children for the most part, but generally wanted the space and the time to decide how many children they would have, partially in an effort to have healthier children that they could take care of better. Jewish women then became involved as activists. Many of the women who wanted to get birth control for themselves then decided that they should spend some time and energy trying to help other people have access to the information and, frankly, the devices, the contraceptive devices that they needed. In the early 20th century, that meant diaphragms. And Jewish women were also involved in the birth control movement as doctors. As women and as Jews, they were discriminated against in the field of medicine in the early 20th century. And so the birth control movement offered many of them a path toward professional activity and also a cause that they could believe in. And in the peace movement, Jewish women were extremely heavily involved in the peace movement. They knew, for one thing, that, to coin a phrase, war is always bad for the Jews. And so that was one reason to be involved in the peace movement. But they also had their, other kinds of personal convictions. And they were really leaders in the women's peace movement in the United States and on the international scene in very significant ways throughout the 1920s and 1930s in particular, until in the late 30s, they were faced with the crisis of Nazism and a decision about whether they stayed in the peace movement or had to give up the universalist ideals they had been fighting for because of the specific threat to them as Jews, which is what most of them, although not all of them, did. So this is a very capsule summary of what I talked about at greater length with pictures in the lecture. So if you haven't seen that, I do encourage you to take a look at it. But all of this adds up to an important legacy of Jewish women's activism in the United States. And of course, I haven't mentioned the many other things they were involved with, Zionist groups like Hadassah, the labor movement, which was not exactly Jewish, but was very inflected Jewish, so much so that many labor unions conducted their business in Yiddish. So that Italian labor organizers, for instance, had to learn Yiddish if they wanted to climb the ranks of the union hierarchy. So that's a very Jewish movement in a lot of ways. And then, of course, after the period that I am most familiar with, after World War II, Jewish women continued this legacy of activism in many, many kinds of ways. I can talk briefly about that in the Q&A if people are interested. I do caution you, though, that my main area of expertise is before World War II. Not after, but Jewish women did continue. And what I do want to say about that is that there used to be this idea somehow that feminism or the women's movement hit this great peak in 1920. Women got the right to vote, and then nothing happened for the next 40 years until Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, and bam, there was feminism again, which is a very problematic narrative, and just actually not just problematic, just untrue and inaccurate. And Jewish women throughout that period of what used to be called the doldrums were again involved with all the major feminist women's issues of the day, everything from anti-nuclear testing to a return to the peace movement, to all kinds of things. Jewish women continued to be involved in industrial feminism, which never went away. The National Women's Party changed its focus after the 19th Amendment and started instead to agitate for the Equal Rights Amendment. A lot of people think that the Equal Rights Amendment also just appeared in the 60s and 70s, but in fact, it was first brought to Congress in 1923, and Jewish women were involved in that long-lasting effort as well. So this is a long legacy, one to be proud of, not one carried out in isolation. Jewish women worked with many other groups of people and many men too. But it's something that I've enjoyed learning a lot about, and I'm happy to have shared some of that knowledge with you in the lecture last night, and we're happy to continue doing so now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Klapper. It's such a pleasure, and thank you for also reminding us of your area of expertise, because so many of the questions and so many of the issues that you've raised have such resonance for all of us today on all of these fronts, whether it be in terms of reproductive rights, suffrage in terms of the role of women in the government, and women's rights, and certainly around issues of peace and alliances. And that's actually where I want to begin a first question to share with you. I'm very curious, and of course you'll hear that this is rooted in today, but I'm very curious to hear if you might share with us a little bit about how you understand the alliances between Jewish women and women of color, particularly in the search for reproductive rights and rights for voting and for participation in government writ large, not just voting. I'm wondering if you can reflect a little bit on those alliances, how their different, the respective religious organizations played a role, because I think that might be very inspiring for us today.
Okay, well, I can, but I have to take a step back because, of course, the historical context was quite different 100, 140 years ago than it is today, which is something extremely important to keep in mind. Historians try not to apply the standards of the present to the past. It's important to do. The questions to ask are, what were the range of possibilities at the time, not what are the range of possibilities today? So one example, one place to actually mention in reference to your question has to do with the term that you used of reproductive rights. There was no such term during the birth control movement of the early 20th century. Now we understand reproductive rights to mean a whole range of things, but primarily probably contraception and abortion. Those two categories were completely distinct from each other in the early 20th century. And in fact, the largest argument the birth control movement made, the strongest argument, the most successful argument it made in many places was to say, if there's more birth control, there will be less abortion. And so, in birth control clinics, there were no abortions. Most of the people who worked there did not know how to do them. Most doctors and nurses did not get that training at all. Actually, that's still kind of true, but it was even more true in the early 20th century. And so there's no category of reproductive rights as such. So it's a little, that the comparison is not exact in that way. In terms of this bigger question of alliances among different groups of people, that is an important question. But again, we have to remember that the context was quite different in the late 19th and early 20th century. At the time, I am not going to stand here, but I'm not going to sit here and say there were no Jews of color, but there were very few visible Jews of color in this period. Okay, again, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that there weren't any, but they were really not very visible. And even the Jews who were immigrating from the Ottoman Empire after its breakup did not necessarily see themselves, nor were they identified as racially distinct, and certainly not as of color in the way we understand that today. So that is something important just to say up front. African-American women and other women of color faced huge obstacles in getting involved in these women's movements, but they insisted on doing so anyway. The classic example of this is that there was a huge suffrage parade the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration in 1913, as he was becoming president. There was a major suffrage parade. And in an effort to make sure that Southern women would participate in this, and I again want to say it's not that only Southern women were racist, but Southern women were more vocal about it in some ways. In an effort, the parade organizers asked African-American women to march at the back. And that was a dilemma for African-American women suffragists, and there were many of them, should they do that in order to participate and have a voice in this movement and be visible on the streets in this parade, or should they say no? And it will be no surprise to you that some agreed to do it and some were less enthused and wouldn't come to the parade at all. Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was an important anti-lynching activist and had been really one of the most prominent African-American women in the country. she was asked by the Illinois delegation in Chicago that she would have been part of to march in the back, and then she just refused. She broke through the crowd and joined the delegation marching in her rightful place. There were Jewish women who objected strongly to very visible moments of racism in the suffrage movement. But there were also Jewish women who said nothing. And in fact, most women in the suffrage movement said nothing. Most women weren't explicitly racist, and most women didn't protest. Most white women and Jewish women certainly saw themselves in that way, just didn't say much about it. So it's a little bit of a misnomer to think about kind of alliances in quite the way that we would today. Again, there were Jewish women who protested racism when they saw it, and they certainly understood it as being dangerous for them too. But to talk about alliances is a little iffy in this period. The situation is a little different when you talk about the birth control movement, where African-American women wanted access to the same contraceptive knowledge and information as was available to other women. They too wanted to make decisions about their own fertility. And there were issues with birth control clinics. Could they serve an integrated population? In the South, the answer was, tragically, but not surprisingly, just no. And the Jewish women who ran birth control clinics in cities like Baltimore typically did serve African-American women, but with separate hours. In other words, they ran segregated clinics effectively. And that was true in most Southern cities that even had a birth control clinic. There were more clinics in the North and in the West than there were in the South. But it is also the case that there were some alliances because the interest of women in controlling the right to their body did cross racial lines. And African-American women did, ask for, sometimes demand, and received clinic services at places all across the United States that were supported by Jewish women's groups and that were often served by Jewish women doctors and nurses, and also were often supported by community boards that would include both the local rabbi and a local minister or two. And so there's a little bit more of an alliance there. And I should just say, as one example, in Harlem, in 1935, the women of Harlem, the African-American women of Harlem, which at the time still had a quite large Jewish population too, actually went to Margaret Sanger and the American Birth Control League and requested that a special clinic be set up for them, which they did with funding from Julius Rosenwald, a Jewish philanthropist who was also funding schools for African-Americans throughout the South at the time. And the Jewish woman was appointed the medical director, and there were African-American nurses working under her, and it didn't go well. This woman was seen by the African-Americans in the community as not really understanding their needs. They complained again, and she was replaced, and she wasn't that upset about it. She understood that she wasn't doing well there, whereas she had done well elsewhere. A new doctor was brought in. It was another Jewish woman, but an African-American doctor also started to work there in addition to the nurses, and things went better after that. So there's a kind of dance around these issues that comes and goes that, is not surprising for the time. It's not surprising for the time.
Not at all, but thank you so much, Dr. Klapper, because it also helps us understand how precious and recent and important and complicated these alliances are and how important they are for us today, certainly moving forward. And of course, it's hard to build that trust and very easy to lose it. I want to turn now and offer each of my colleagues the opportunity, each of my colleagues on this panel, to offer a question, ask a question of you as well. We have a wonderful, distinguished panel of academics and of leaders here in our community who have been benefiting and want to be sure that we can even expand further our knowledge and the knowledge of everyone who's gathered here with us. And that said, I want to invite all of those participating this evening. There are a few dozen of us here, and I want to invite everyone to offer a question if you have one for Dr. Klapper about these issues, and you can simply do so by submitting it in the chat. I'll turn now to Dr. Leslie Ribovich. Did I say that correctly? Hopefully I did.
Yes.
We're so excited to welcome you here representing Transylvania University, and I'd like to invite you to ask a question of Dr. Klapper.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rabbi Sabbath. So as Rabbi Sabbath said, I'm Dr. Leslie Ribovich, Assistant Professor of Religion at Transylvania University. And I had all said a question about sources and how you ended up coming to the sources. And if you want to answer that, that's fine. But I feel in the spirit of this being a talk about Jewish women and a lot of sort of intimacies and family things. My mother seems to have posted something in the chat. So I'm all the way from California. So I'm going to read her question, and you can start with that. And if
mothers.
Yeah, I know.
We want to honor our mothers. Thank you.
Yes, that's sort of, and there is some discussion of honoring our family. So I'll start with my mom's question, and if you, Deborah Hirsch, and if you want to also talk about sources, that's fine too. But the question is, after decades of progress, women's reproductive health and rights have come under threat and been curtailed in many parts of the country in recent years. That threat seems even more urgent with the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her replacement on the Supreme Court. What do you see as the most important role that Jewish women and organizations can play in protecting and preserving women's right to control their own bodies and reproductive choices?
Okay. Well, I'm going to duck this question a little bit because it's talking about the contemporary scene is a little bit above my pay grade as a historian. What I will say is that there are organizations, particularly the National Council of Jewish Women, which have been involved, which were heavily involved in the birth control movement and now are heavily involved in the reproductive rights movement. In other words, there has always been a presence of Jewish women in whatever you want to call it, for at least over the past century in dealing with these issues. Also remember that there's diversity within the Jewish community in terms of opinions on various parts of these issues. Some, some see it as situational, some groups are more concerned about, traditional observance and the way that interfaces with people's personal lives and how they conduct their intimate lives. And I do think that is something that's important to remember. Like with anything else, there's no one Jewish opinion about reproductive rights any more than there is about pretty much anything else. So I do think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And I think I'm going to leave it there just as, but it is worthy of note. Actually, when Margaret Sanger, and not just Sanger, I actually don't want to give her all the credit. She's not the only person who is a leader in the birth control movement. When the leaders of the birth control movement, which did include Jewish women among them, were trying to figure out how to make the whole idea more popular in the United States and more acceptable in the public sphere, I should say, since huge numbers of American women of all backgrounds were already practicing birth control in one way or another. When they were trying to think about who would be the best target audience, right? And the overwhelming majority of Americans, certainly in the early part of the 20th century, were Protestants. So that was one way to go. And mainline churches were, eventually quite supportive of the birth control movement. But Catholics were basically being ruled out. Catholics, of course, did not always and continue to not actually pay much attention to the official line on what they were supposed to be doing. That was certainly true in the early years, as well as you can see from the pictures of Italian Catholic women lined up for blocks to get into birth control clinics. They didn't care so much what the church said, just like many Jews didn't care what halacha or traditional Jewish law or the rabbis said. But the Jewish community looked to the birth control leaders of the movement like a population that would probably be interested in this because they were so interested in other progressive social causes. Does that mean every Jewish person was progressive on every issue? No, of course not. Not true then, not true now. But there is this long history of that kind of progressivism on various issues within American Jewish history.
Thank you so much, Dr. Klapper. So many questions emerge out of every answer you give, but I'm going to push us forward and turn now to my colleague, Rabbi David Wirtschafter of Temple Adath, Israel.
Dr. Klapper, we've heard so much about the impact of this pandemic on American life and what the new normal may look like when we emerge from this crisis. As you well know, this isn't the first time we've faced a pandemic, and I'm curious as to the degree to which, whether we call it the flu of 1918, the Spanish flu, whatever term we want to use for it, how that pandemic impacted the suffrage movement, the peace movement, and the birth control movement that you've spoken about the last two evenings so eloquently.
Okay, the pandemic did have an impact on the suffrage movement, particularly in the last push to get the 19th Amendment not just passed because it already passed in Congress but ratified. Remember that the influenza pandemic started in 1918, but actually lasted, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, for a long time. They had several different waves of it. It sounds all too familiar to us now, but it lasted much longer than I hope will be the case, in our current situation. So the initial outbreak in 1918 did stop, it stopped people. It stopped marches for a while. It stopped, it stopped parades. It stopped major events. people did, if you look at pictures, people did wear masks and were told to stand at least a little further away from each other. They didn't necessarily have the 6-foot thing going on, but there were fewer public gatherings for sustained periods during the Spanish flu. And of course, you know, a lot of people died, right? Something like 600, you know, more than 600,000 Americans died of influenza during the various waves of that pandemic. That's, you know, it's a lot of people, plus a lot of people got sick. And unlike what it looks like today, and I'm certainly not saying this from any official medical capacity, but young people were much more likely to die of the influenza in 1918, 1919, and 1920 than seems to be the case today. So that knocked out a lot of activists. The main place where it really played a role was in the final push to get 3/4 of the states to ratify the 19th Amendment. Of course, it would not become part of the Constitution without that. And some of the really important suffrage leaders, including Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the large mainstream suffrage association, she had a really bad case of influenza and they weren't sure she was going to make it. And that would have been incredibly demoralizing. She was actually in a hotel room. I mean, she just, when she got sick, she couldn't even go home. She really, it was a close call. And there were suffragists all over the United States who were really praying for her because they were concerned that if at this very late date, I mean, they were concerned for her as a person, of course, but in terms of the cause, they were also concerned that at this late date, basically the general of the movement passed away or became incapacitated, what would happen then? So it did impact the suffrage movement. And actually, in a weird way, it had less of an impact on the birth control movement, and that is because the influenza epidemic happened during a kind of interregnum where there was a period where there actually were not very many birth control clinics because of so many legal challenges that were happening. Once the first clinic opened and closed in 1916, the clinic movement per se didn't actually start up again until 1923 when the legal environment had changed in some states. So the gap of those years included the influenza epidemic. This doesn't mean there was nothing happening during that period. The periodical birth control review, for instance, although completely illegal to put in the mail, continued to publish. There was local activism, people could get more information. It became somewhat easier to get your hands on diaphragms, especially in urban areas. But there was this burst of energy at the beginning of what we think of as the movement, and then a little bit of a pause, and that pause included the influenza. So it didn't have as much of an impact there. And for peace, I actually don't think it had as much of an impact at all, because in the aftermath of World War I, or what they then called the Great War, there was such horror at the idea of something so catastrophic happening again, that was a moment of great energy for the peace movement. And even though there weren't large rallies in many places because of the illness, that was actually a moment when the peace movement was taking off. So it had less of an impact there.
Thank you very much.
That was very heartening. Sorry.
No, not at all. I was merely saying thank you. You're right. It is heartening.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Loida Martel, and I am the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean at Lexington Theological Seminary. Good evening, Dr. Klapper. It's a pleasure and a privilege to meet you. Let me just say very quickly that I've gotten feedback from my professors and my students. They appreciated very, very much your presentation yesterday evening. So thank you for that. I heard your earlier disclaimer that you are a historian and do not respond to contemporary issues. But for me, I think that the issues of the past as a person of color continue to come into the present. And so if my question is inappropriate, then please just deny me the answer, and we'll move on very quickly. But it seems to me that we oftentimes talk about women and women's issues, and in using that encompassing kind of language, we forget about the differences. And it reminds me of Kathleen Cahill, that notices that for African-American suffragists in the earlier 20th century, it was about racial violence aimed at the communities as much as it was about their decision to fight for the vote that inspired them. And it seems to me that as much as time passes, for at least communities of color, it seems that it remains the same. And even as we're celebrating the passage of both the 19th Amendment and in part, I think, the 15th Amendment, that vote came to largely a white community, but it did not come to a community of color until almost the mid-1960s. And it came to them very much in alliance with Jewish communities. So I guess I'm hearkening back to Rabbi Sabbath's question about alliances. And I promise you, we did not agree on this question, but it is a pressing question for me. And before I actually ask the question, let me just, I'm going to do a little parenthesis here. And it's that yesterday you mentioned that the problem with eugenics pretty much went away in the early 1920s, or in the earliest 20th century is what you said, the earliest that it was a problem of the earliest 20th century and not so much today. And I just want to sort of emphasize that in 1970, a doctor in the public health area, Dr. Helen Trias Rodriguez, documented how women of color, particularly Puerto Rican women, African American women, and Native American women, were being sterilized against their consent. And in 2010, a prison in California was sued because they were sterilizing Chicana prisoners against their consent. So there's a way in which reproductive rights for people of color, in part, yes, it's contraceptives, but on the other part, it is also what Dr. Trias Rodriguez called sterilization abuse. So for us, it's a mixed bag, because there's, on the one hand, there's rights, but on the other hand, for us, it's this continued abuse. So I bring that and I'm going to get to my question. In light of this history of oppression, and given the wonderful historical framework that you shared with Jewish women involved in suffrage and peace movements, fighting for women's reproductive rights, and knowing that the Jewish community has traditionally been allies of the African American community and civil rights movement, and those disenfranchised by Jim Crow in the South, I want to ask you, how can and how will the Jewish community, and in particular, Jewish women and feminists, be allies to communities of color in these critical times, as we sort of have a rinse and repeat? We're seeing a resurgence of Jim Crow in our times. As people of color take to the streets in the midst of a pandemic to fight for the right to vote, to fight for the right to be heard, to fight for the right to live, and for the right to fight for the right not to be sterilized or experimented on. The contraceptives that many white women fight for today, Puerto Rican women were the guinea pigs of pharmaceuticals until the 1990s for those medications. So how do we fight for the right to not be experimented on, the right to walk on streets and not be shot? How can how can the history of Jewish suffragettes being allied with people of color, what can that teach us today about those alliances?
Thank you, Dr. Martel.
Thank you. All right, so I just want to clarify something. I am pretty sure I didn't say eugenics went away. My point was that eugenics, the language of eugenics, which had been respectable through the 20s into the early 30s, was no longer respectable. And that is an important distinction, like the idea of, a kind of respectable race science that was explicitly taught at the university level, this kind of thing. You know, once the Nazis are in power, once the Nuremberg laws are passed, the language of eugenics, the rhetoric of eugenics becomes less and less acceptable in the public sphere than it had been before. So I'm pretty sure I didn't quite say that it was, you know, it went away, but there is a difference in terms of how it's received, what the language is around how that's received. There's actually critiques of the category of reproductive rights for exactly the reason that you're mentioning, that because it's actually, on the one hand, it can be helpful as an umbrella category, but there are ways in which it's not helpful because it actually includes lots of different things that mean different things to different people at different times. There's a big difference between the early birth control movement, which is what I know the most about, which is always voluntary. Nobody could ever force anybody to go into a clinic. That is very different than the forced sterilization campaigns you're mentioning, which were happening just as much in the 1920s as in the 1970s, and with less, I don't know, with less obfuscation. I mean, it was just an open part of what many states, most states in the United States had, had the ability to force sterilization. And of course, unfortunately, women of color and poor women and women with disabilities were the most likely to be forced into this. At the time, I'll say again, these were not campaigns that were kind of, people were fighting against them, but not in parallel, not in an umbrella group. And I think there really is, there are questions to ask about who benefits from which parts of the things that now get folded into the reproductive rights question. I think instead of fully answering your question, Dr. Martel, you're going to have to forgive me. What I'd like to do instead is say something quickly about another term that is in use today that was certainly not in use at the time, and not really, and barely even 25 years ago, and that's the term intersectionality. The idea that people, comprise multiple identities at any given moment, and that you can't just reify people by being as just one thing at any given time. And what's interesting is that I think there's much more attention to this and to people's multiple identities and to the way they intersect in their lives, the way they bring groups of people together, and also within any one individual could cause one person to have a variety of ideas or ideologies or activist motivations at any given moment. What's interesting to me is that intersectionality doesn't have a lot of room for religion. You hear a lot about race and class and sexuality, ethnicity, national background. I mean, these are all, I'm not denying the salience of any of these categories. But in a history of the suffrage movement, for instance, we have this newer history that's been coming out the last few years, and especially in the past year or two, including Kathleen Cahill's wonderful book about suffragists of color. We actually brought her in to speak at my university last year. It's a wonderful book. But it's all about, it's about race, which is extremely important, right? It is extremely important to know that there were all kinds of groups in the United States fighting for suffrage, and they had maybe different motivations from each other, they had different reasons for, and the 19th Amendment had a different impact on them. So that an African-American woman like Ida B. Wells Barnett, I mentioned before, was able to vote in Chicago after the 19th Amendment, but her relatives back in Tennessee might not have been able to, so that geography played a role. And there's much more attention to Native American women who weren't even citizens in many cases during this period, to Latina women, to all these different groups, to Asian American women. And remember that at the time that the suffrage amendment was passed, Asians had no path to citizenship at all. So that there were very few who were able to vote. So I think, I take your point. I appreciate the opportunity to say again that the 19th Amendment did not immediately enfranchise all women. What we're not seeing is a lot of attention to religion in the suffrage movement or in general to women's history, which is a little odd because the earliest women's history really focused on religion and particularly a certain kind of Protestantism as the reason for why people would get involved. Religion motivated people to become abolitionists, for instance, or to get involved with the women's rights movement. And for Jewish women in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, not for all of them, but for some of them, Jewishness or Judaism, which can mean lots of different things to different people, was a motivating factor. And yet Jewish women never made it into the narrative because they were seen as white. I did see a comment in the Q&A that Jews were racialized during this period, and I agree with that. But Jewish women themselves typically saw themselves as white. They certainly benefited from the, kind of the privilege of their skin color in many cases. And again, that was true even for Ottoman Jews immigrating to the United States in large part. And so for them, religion was a more salient factor for many of them. And yet we don't ever hear about that. so that we, there needs to be more research about this. I mean, that intersectionality should not just take out the vector of religion, which is just as important an identity factor as anything else to a lot of people. And so I say, not only should we have lots, more information about Jewish women activists, but we should know more about Catholic activists and Mormon activists. How do the Latter-day Saints think about this? There is actually new research on this, but they're less than it should be. And even the newer narratives of suffrage and of women's activism don't pay enough attention to religion. And I think that paying more attention to that history and the way in which certain kinds of Christianity, certain denominations, and evangelical approach really brought lots of groups of women together into alliance, then, and as you say later, during the civil rights movement, is really important. Many of the white women who were active in the civil rights movement were motivated by religion. A huge number of them became activists through their work with the Young Women's Christian Association, for instance. And so I think that it is important to look at these, at intersectionality, but also at the actual intersections of where something like religion can motivate groups of people to come together.
Thank you so much, Dr. Klapper and Dr. Martel. Clearly, we could continue to discuss these issues. I want to invite more questions, though, also from colleagues and from participants. We turn now to a member of our committee and our panel, Dr. Beth Goldstein of the University of Kentucky and of OZS as well. Beth.
Thank you for that, Rabbi Sabbath, and thank you, Dr. Klapper, for your answers to the questions and for your lecture last night. What I'd like to do is to combine a question that I have with one from one of our attendees, from Mark Clark. And this actually is a nice follow-up, I think, from your comments just now on intersectionality and religion. You've written, prior to the book from which your lecture was drawn, you wrote 2 books on children. One on Jewish girls coming of age in America, 1860 to 1920, and then a second one titled Small Strangers, the Experiences of Immigrant Children in the United States, 1880 to 1920. And so I wonder if you could speak to us about the ways in which growing up Jewish, as Jewish girls becoming Jewish women, transitioning to the United States from elsewhere or growing up in the United States was important to the formation of activism within Jewish women's circles, and combine that then with Mark's question, which is recognizing again the historical context of these communities, that he asked what affected the 2 major waves of Jewish immigration and the resulting class differences have on the ability of Jewish women to organize. So the intersectionality of American identities, immigrant identities in these different ways with social class for these Jewish women.
Okay. Well, class did play an important role within Jewish women's activism, particularly, and well, maybe not particularly, it played an important role in Jewish women's activism. To take the example of the suffrage movement, which had very large, very widespread support within the Jewish community across class lines, but there were people came to it in different ways. So that working class women, okay, especially those who were working in terrible conditions, which many of them were, and sometimes we're talking about girls, not women, adolescent girls, the kinds of adolescent girls that were killed in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911, where most of the people killed were under the age of 18, Jewish and some Italian working girls. So working girls and women came into the suffrage movement. They did, in a more abstract way, think, well, they should have the right to vote if they're citizens, but in a more practical way, they also thought, well, they could, the best way to improve their working conditions was to gain this formal instrument of political power, right? The politicians would have to listen to them more if they had the right to vote. And so working class women sometimes had different interests in getting the right to vote than middle and upper class women did. Middle and upper class Jewish women, many of whom worked in alliance in groups like the Women's Trade Union League with working class women, were sensitive. Many of them were quite sensitive to these issues, but they also had their own experiences of being involved in all kinds of women's clubs that had agendas that went beyond just the merely social. They had a larger idea of what social activism was. It wasn't just sitting around and reading Shakespeare, although many of them did that, but it might also be going out into the community and doing good in the community. And for American Jewish women of whatever background, seeing the waves of new Jewish migrants coming in motivated them even more to be out and about in the community doing this kind of work. And there too, they would sometimes run into obstacles. They couldn't get done everything they wanted to get done, or they thought that things were not being done well because they didn't have the right to vote. And so actually getting involved in political, look at lowercase p, let's call it political activism and social activism, often motivated women across class boundaries to go into the suffrage movement. The birth control movement's a little different because that's just a very personal, I always like to say, you know, the personal is political is a slogan from the 60s, but what could be more personal than controlling your own body? And that is something that was true. Even if they didn't use the slogan, it was just as true in the earlier part of the 20th century as well. And there were some class issues involved. It was clear to everybody that having fewer children might lead to more economic mobility. And in fact, middle-class families were much smaller than working-class families. And so there was a relationship there too between the activism and what people were getting involved in. In terms of growing up, and I think this also does speak to the question of what difference did it make for the women that I'm writing about that they grew up Jewish? And I do think that it makes a difference. It's not that they're the only group of people who grow up in a particular kind of environment and are motivated by it to activism. Clearly, right, African-American women growing up in a Jim Crow world are automatically from birth just imbued with a desire to make the world a better place and to seek and to achieve more justice, and certainly to end racial violence, as we heard from Dr. Martell, which is a really important a thing that's happening at the same time as all these other movements that I'm talking about. So that is, for Jewish women, not all of them were, in fact, relatively few Jewish women in the United States through the 1920s were traditionally observant, the way we might understand that today. But they were traditional in the sense that they drew upon Jewish themes as part of their activism. And again, here's another term that was not in use at the time, but the idea of it was very widespread, the term tikkun olam, or repairing the world. That you don't find that in the period that I'm talking about here. That term was just not in use. But the idea of it, the idea that it was Jewish, as a Jewish person, it was your job to take a look around the world, see what was wrong, and work to make it right, was very powerful for Jewish women from any number of backgrounds. For Eastern European Jewish women immigrants, who were coming from an environment in Eastern Europe where women were extremely economically important to the household and were often in the public sphere even more than the men, a reversal of the kinds of gender roles more prevalent in Western Europe and the United States. When they got to the United States, they weren't interested in going home and closing the door, no. And if they couldn't get what they wanted, they would do something about it in public. So for instance, in 1902, there was a series of kosher meat riots where Jewish women, Jewish housewives, right, who were protested on the street and by disrupting synagogue services, a severe rise in the price of kosher meat. Right, there they are. So these are the people who might be seen as the most traditional. And in fact, they were actually going into their synagogues, and stopping services to voice their protest against the people in their community who are raising the prices of kosher meat. So their Jewishness was incredibly involved with public activity for working and immigrant women. And for middle-class women too, there was this idea that women, a kind of 19th century idea, but carried forward into the 20th century, that women were a moral force for good. And how much more so should Jewish women be a moral force for good when their entire history was about kind of standing out wherever they were and serving as a beacon in this way. Again, that's not language we would necessarily see today, but it was very powerful at the time. And so across class boundaries, and regardless of whether people were immigrant themselves or the children of immigrants or fourth generation Americans, which they might well have been by then, or sometimes even more, as I mentioned in my talk, Maud Nathan, an important suffragist, had roots that went back to the colonial period. She was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. For all these women, Jewishness was a motivating force. What it meant to them was different. Jewishness did not have one meaning. It could be ethnic, it could be religious, it could be cultural, and in a sense, it could, and then for many, did come to actually, Jewishness just meant activism. And that's something that carried forward for some people into the 20th century.
Thank you so much, Dr. Klapper. I think we're all gonna take that idea of being a force for good with us forward, certainly into the days ahead. We turn now to another colleague of our committee and on our panel, Dr. Carol Barnsley, to ask another question.
Thank you, Rabbi Sabbath. I would like to share, I'm Carol Barnsley and I'm Associate Professor at Transylvania. And I would like to share a question that's actually been posted on our chat here. It comes from Professor Popkin. He asks, hello, Professor Klapper. My question grows out of the research project about my grandmother. My question is, how involved were Jewish women in organized efforts to combat anti-Semitism and fascism in the interwar years? Did women have significant roles in the ADL and other organizations?
Okay, so as I mentioned in the lecture, Jewish women did face anti-Semitism in all of these movements. It was a significant problem. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in American society. We tend, I think, to think of American Semitism as never being that big a deal because by comparison, and of course by comparison, when the comparison is Nazi Germany, what can you say? But it didn't feel that way to the Jews at the time, right? Certainly not the Jews in the late 19th century and the early 20th century who had not yet run into this, moment in history, this horrible moment in history that we know was coming, but they did not. That's something else, important to keep in mind, right? We know what happened, they did not. They didn't know what was coming, etc. So there was anti-Semitism and it was on the rise in the late 19th century. Jews who had been accepted in some social quarters actually were less accepted in the 1890s and early 1900s than they had been before. This was a growing problem, in part because of the massive migration that were coming to the United States during this period. Something like 25 million immigrants came to the US between 1880 and 1925, including 2.5 million Jews. And that provoked a tremendous amount of xenophobia and racism because people were coming from all over the world, including Asia. There was particular sentiment against the Japanese during this period and governmental deals to limit the number of Japanese immigrants to the United States. And again, even if they got to the US, they could not become citizens. And even if they did become citizens, again, here's a retrospective thing, but of course we know that during World War II, that didn't help them from being sent to internment, prevent them from being sent to internment camps. So there was just a lot of anti-foreign sentiment. There was serious concern among the Protestant majority about the fact that probably the majority of this new immigration was either Catholic or Jewish, and that seemed completely unacceptable to a Protestant majority. Of course, I'm speaking with very broad strokes here. Not everybody felt that way, but generally speaking, there was widespread. So that the Ku Klux Klan, for instance, which had gone underground a little bit after the 1870s, 1880s, and partially because Jim Crow laws actually made life better as far as they could see, although not for communities of color, but for them. But the Ku Klux Klan had a revival because of this immigration. And it then joined, not only was it incredibly and violently and dangerously racist, but it was also anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic against these new groups that were coming in. So anti-Semitism was a growing problem. And in the 20s and the 30s, it was really virulent. In the 30s and the early years of the Depression, Jews were blamed for the Depression. There was a lot of kind of lowercase c conservative resistance to the New Deal, which was sometimes referred to in a derogatory way as the quote unquote, the Jew deal, in a critique of how many Jewish people were in FDR's government and in the new bureaucracy that the New Deal was setting up. Father Coughlin, who was a Catholic priest, was called the radio priest. He broadcast out of Detroit at a time when radio was still relatively new. He had an enormous national audience, and he was rabidly anti-Semitic. Major political figures, or major public figures, I should say, like Charles Lindbergh, were quite anti-Semitic. And this all just got worse and worse. And it continued to get worse as the United States, it looked like, might have to go into what was going to be the Second World War. It got worse and worse. And so American Jews were dealing with quite a lot of anti-Semitism. There were quotas in schools, there were quotas in professions. There were certain professions that just didn't have any Jews, right? You couldn't be a banker unless you were in a Jewish bank. If you were Jewish, no bank would hire you. Insurance, engineering, many major professional kinds of fields were just not open to Jews. And of course, that much more, they weren't open to Jewish women. So anti-Semitism is a real problem. And of course, Jewish women did participate in trying to fight back against it. But to Professor Popkin's question about the major defense organizations, like the Anti-Defamation League, which grew out of B'nai B'rith, which was a 19th century Jewish fraternal organization, or the American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Congress, they were actually the more relevant ones for the interwar years. Jewish women were involved in those, but because they were women, there just wasn't a lot of place for them. Those were very heavily male-dominated organizations. And so Jewish women very rarely held leadership positions in those organizations. The Joint Distribution Committee, which tried to help Jewish communities around the world, particularly in Free State Israel and Palestine and in the communities devastated by World War I, did hire Jewish women to go and kind of work on the ground, but they very rarely rose to leadership positions. And so Jewish women were actually more likely to fight against anti-Semitism, either in their local communities through alliances with a variety of groups, including very often interracial groups, because they saw it all as part of a package of hatred that needed to be resisted, but also through Jewish women's groups. So Hadassah, took some lead in this in the National Council of Jewish Women, and particularly the synagogue sisterhoods, because they were local. The local chapters of synagogue sisterhoods understood what the issues were, on where they lived, and how best to fight back against them. And so those are the primary venues through which Jewish women fought anti-Semitism in the US in the 20s and the 30s. After World War II, the major Jewish defense organizations had somewhat more of a role for women, but certainly nothing like parity, and women still very rarely rose to leadership roles.
Rabbi Wertschafter.
Thank you to Dr. Klapper, to Rabbi Sabbath for moderating tonight's panel, to all of the panelists, to all of our partners, the organizers, and the Moosnick family for its participation in this important annual event. We began tonight with commemoration of innocent lives taken in Pittsburgh and in Louisville 2 years ago. We express our appreciation as a Jewish community to everyone who rallied to our support at Nordsworthy Auditorium as 1,000 Lexingtonians gathered to share in our grief. We close tonight with a dedication to the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who dedicated her life's work to the pursuit of helping our nation live up to its promises. She told us women belong in all places where decisions are being made. And she said, I would like to be remembered as someone who used whatever talent she had to do her work to the very best of her ability. Zichrona livracha, may her memory be a blessing, and may we honor her legacy by using the talents, the resources, the means that we have to make a difference. May we not only continue on her work by exercising our right to vote, but by getting out there and protecting everyone's right to vote in dignity and in safety.
Amen. Dr. Klapper, you have inspired us. With this new knowledge, you have inspired us to recommit ourselves to protect the vulnerable. May we all be activists for the rights of all people, of all citizens to vote, and for all people to have the health care they need and deserve. And may each of us go forth from this evening and be a force for good. Good evening.